I'm Andrew Summers. I'm an author and publisher. We also make short videos and have a large photographic collection, and we give talks such as this. I'd like to thank Chelmsford Civic Society for hosting the talk today. I'm going to talk about a deadly outbreak of influenza and its consequences in Essex that occurred in the main over a 9-week period between mid-October and the end of November 1918. Now I'm just going to put 1918 into context, so let's wind back and think what communications were like then. Now this is through the whole of the First World War between 1914 and 1918. Just remember, it was a time when there was no radio, no television, no internet or social media, there were few telephones, and photography and film were in their infancy. And remember, if you could not read, you had to rely on word of mouth to get the news. Now, by the way, the word influenza is thought to have derived from the 14th century Italian folklore, where influenza del freddo was a term for diseases attributed to the influence of the cold, and the Italian for cold is freddo. It also gave rise to this little rhyme.
So here we go. I had a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened the window, and influenza.
So we're back. Anyway, a quick commercial break. The core of this talk is drawn from our book, They Did Their Duty, Essex Farm, and it's available from the usual outlets. As the First World War drew to a close in late 1918, the world was struck by an influenza pandemic, often referred to as the Spanish Lady or the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is somewhat misleading, but I'll come to that shortly. It is difficult to convey the magnitude of this outbreak, as at the time the country was still at war and the authorities in the UK using DORA, and I'll show a slide now for DORA.
So we have DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, and it went to great lengths to suppress the fact that thousands of soldiers were either dying or incapacitated because of the virus. Reporting the influenza outbreak in the military was considered to be detrimental to the morale not only amongst soldiers but in the civilian population too. Similar draconian reporting measures were put in place in the USA, France and even Germany. And although the news of the widespread infection amongst soldiers was largely suppressed, nothing could or was done to stop the spread of the infection itself. The number of dead as a result of military action during the 4-year conflict was estimated at 20 million. The same figure was recorded for those wounded. The totals were divided almost equally between military and civilians. Yet the number of dead in the influenza pandemic worldwide was conservatively estimated as twice that of the war deaths, perhaps even 5 times as high, 100 million. Precise figures are difficult to come by because of poor record keeping. And remember, there was no track and trace then. The flu pandemic of 1918 was the deadliest in modern history and estimated to have infected 500 million people worldwide, about 1/3 of the population. The flu spread to many places where there had been no direct fighting. Almost without exception, every town and village throughout the United Kingdom and on the battlefields of France and Belgium have a memorial to those who died in the trenches. The example on this slide is in France, in a town called Monchy-le-Preux, which is to the east of Arras, where the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment and the Essex Yeomanry horse soldiers took part. Yet, despite the huge numbers of flu deaths, there is almost nothing to commemorate those who died in the pandemic. This is perhaps not surprising. Heroic young men doing their duty and making the ultimate sacrifice in tragic circumstances have always been remembered since time immemorial, whereas a silent killer with no cure that occurs regularly just creeps up and is part of the natural order. So, in October 1918, whilst the end of the fighting in Europe seemed imminent, this new and deadly foe became established on the home front. There was no cure, no vaccine. The flu was silent and struck without warning and killed indiscriminately. So war dead and flu dead, despite the numbers, is not really comparing like with like. And this brings me back to the Spanish flu.
Although the pandemic became commonly known as the Spanish flu, it did not originate in Spain. The name only came about because the outbreak in Spain was given publicity, particularly when members of the Spanish royal family became infected. As there were no reporting restrictions in Spain and the country was neutral anyway, a Madrid news agency simply cabled a report to London as part of its normal reporting activities. The Allies did nothing to dispel the rumours that the flu supposedly came from Spain. Spain or even the weather seemed convenient scapegoats. And naturally the powers that be in the UK and the US military leadership were desperate nothing should interfere with the war effort and that no blame should be attributed to the High Command. And of course, here in England or Britain, we have the Armada, another invasion from Spain, ingrained in the national psyche. So the Spanish were convenient scapegoats. And I'll put a report from the Essex Weekly News on screen
now. And this is an extract from the Essex Weekly News of October 1918, and it's part of their opinion piece, Between Ourselves. I'll read an extract so as you've got the general idea. It's called Between Ourselves and the headline is The Spanish Flu. Influenza, called Spanish because presumably it started in a violent form in Spain a few months ago, is exceedingly prevalent all over the country. A number of schools in Essex have been closed owing to the ravages of the malady amongst teachers and pupils. No doubt the weather we have recently experienced has had something to do with the rapid spread of this particularly active and virulent epidemic. I'll stop there, but I'll leave the piece up on screen for a few more seconds so as you can have a further look at it. Whilst that's up there, I'll continue. Yet, as the outbreak took hold, whole families were struck down and died within a few hours, and schools, hospitals, offices and factories were closed. When undertakers ran out of coffins, the authorities could not hide the presence of the catastrophe any longer. Such was the crisis that the Minister of National Service, Sir Auckland Geddes, and here is a picture of him here just coming up. Geddes, in most cases, authorised the deferment of the call-up of doctors for overseas military service and released them to help on the home front.
How the outbreak started and where it originated is still a matter of speculation. The probability, and I say probability, is that the flu originated in China, then somehow crossed to the USA where it took hold. In turn, the infection was brought to Europe by American soldiers who crossed the Atlantic in crowded ships to join the war effort. From there, it passed on to the British and French. In turn, from the European ports, where the US soldiers disembarked and the crews from different merchant ships mingled, the virus was carried by 6 sailors around the world, albeit in ignorance. Another theory, and again this is just a theory, as the infection amongst the British and French came from the Chinese Labour Corps. During the war, nearly 100,000 Chinese volunteered to help in the Allied effort. From Hong Kong and Shanghai, the volunteers were shipped across the Pacific, then across Canada in packed railway cars before being taken by ship again to the UK. A truly horrendous journey of some 12,000 miles. On arrival in France, the labourers were tasked with digging trenches, unloading ships or trains, laying tracks, building roads and clearing battlefield sites of unexploded ordnance and body parts. The Chinese lived in labour camps, bursting at the seams where the infection spread rapidly. However, to this day, the source of the outbreak cannot be confirmed and probably will never be known. A host of factors help fan the epidemic, and we'll take a look at these on the next slides.
As you can imagine, there was poor hygiene and squalid conditions in the trenches, and overcrowding in the camps. Hospital and medical facilities were overwhelmed, and doctors and nurses went sick. Medical advice was poor or non-existent. And for many civilians too, years of poor diet and living in substandard housing was a factor that broke down immune systems. Nevertheless, secrecy and ignorance played a key part too. Now, whilst secrecy and censorship were order of the day on matters military, the local press was relatively free to report sickness and death in the civilian population, and this they did with a certain amount of relish. Perhaps another unusual aspect of this flu pandemic, and also as yet unexplained, was the age of the victims. The traditional victims of flu, the very young and the elderly, were surviving better than healthy young adults. Those aged 20 to 40 were much more likely to die. It was also noted the epidemic was as severe in densely crowded urban areas as in thinly populated areas. Essex in 1918 was still a largely rural county. There was no Basildon, no Harlow, and just think of all the extra housing that was added after World War II. Anyway, let's go back to the figures, and the next slide shows the estimated civilian death toll, which is the best guess for this short period of 1918-1919. And this figure was put at 228,000. Whereas in the 4 years of World War I, the UK recorded 900,000 plus military deaths, which included Commonwealth or Empire soldiers. Another statistic is that during World War I, the USA lost more soldiers, which was 63,000, to disease, largely influenza, than in combat, 53,000. But bear in mind the US was only military active in numbers from the spring of 1918. That's just over 5 months. Now turning to Essex, locally on the number of flu deaths we can be more precise. And to a certain extent we have to thank this man, Dr. John Clough Thresh. He was the county's chief medical officer. He stated in his final report just before he retired, and this was published in the Essex Weekly News of the 28th of November 1919, that was 1 year after World War I ended, that 21% of the deaths in Essex for 1918 were attributed to the malady of influenza and complications that followed, such as pneumonia. This next slide shows that 2,495 deaths were reported, which was twice as many as tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and all other infectious diseases put together. Dr. Thresh added that if the influenza outbreak hadn't occurred, the annual death rate in Essex amongst civilians would have been the lowest on record. Now, I do not have any figures for the number of military deaths that were attributed to Essex during World War I.
Let's take a look at some of the human tragedies reported in the local press of the day. Newspapers, often with a degree of relish, reported the most appalling personal tragedies in just a matter of a few lines. And I'd like to take a look now at the Barking Chronicle of the 25th of October 1918.
And this is the piece from the Barking Chronicle of the 25th of October 1918. It's headed "Father Kills Child, Wounds Another and Attempts Suicide." The epidemic of influenza seems to have been responsible for many tragic happenings, and it is attributed a peculiarly sad affair which caused a painful sensation in the Manor Park district on Friday night. James Shaw, 33, a crane driver in the docks, who resides in Worcester Road and had been at home for some days, suffering from an attack of the disease, apparently in a fit of depression, killed one of his children, a baby daughter, aged 2 years, wounded another daughter, aged 7, then cut his own throat with the blade of a safety razor. At the same time, his wife, who was also afflicted, lay in an adjoining bedroom. So that's just an extract of that particular report. What I'm going to put up next is some slides reported from the paper, and I won't say anything. I'll leave them on screen for about 10 seconds each, so you can get an idea of what was happening in that period and what was reported in the papers. Truly shocking. Now, I received this letter, a copy which is now on the screen, which has come from Pam, which is in turn from Brian Streeter, and it illustrates the tragedy of war. Now, the letter's addressed to Gunner Bertie William Buckhurst of the Royal Garrison Artillery, who was serving on the front during October 1918, and it's from Kate. She writes, "Dear Bert, I just thought I would drop a line to you hoping you are keeping safe and well. What do you think of this war? Will it soon come to a finish, or will it keep on forever? I do sincerely hope it will end because of all you boys. We keep hearing in the papers about peace terms, and it quite gets on our nerves. In Hornsey we have the flu about. Terrible and simply shocking. The people are dying with it. But thank God none of us are taken bad. We are all keeping well and in the pink. You might let Mum know whether you got your parcel quite safe. Let's hope you have, as it seems to take such a lot off Mother's mind. Doris sent the parcel off, so hoping you have received it. Can you let us know when you're coming home, as we should like to get things ready. Mother and us send love and kisses, and wishing you the best of luck from your loving sister, Kate. Kiss, kiss, kiss." Gunner Bertie William Buckhurst, at the age of 21, was killed on the 14th of October 1918, just under a month before the armistice was signed, so he never received his parcel or letter.
So sad, and it illustrates just the tragedy of war. Now, turning to medical advice, this then was much the same as we hear today. And let's look in general what was issued.
In summary, stay away from crowds and self-isolate if you feel unwell. What they tended to say, if you feel unwell, go to bed and stay there, and wash your hands, and disinfectant was quite in vogue at the time. This advice came from our good friend Dr. Thresh, and he had printed in the paper the following. Dr. Thresh, the county medical officer, says an infected person by coughing or sneezing may spread infection throughout a room and infect every susceptible person in a crowded carriage or car. He added, it is hopeless to expect people to wear masks or large respirators, but it is not too much to expect people showing signs of a cold to isolate themselves at home, in bed preferred, until the diagnosis is obtained, especially when an epidemic of influenza threatens. On the other hand, there was somewhat mixed messaging, and what I'm about to tell you was all published in the local press in black and white during the time. And remember, there was no radio. Now this is an interesting one, and this is official advice from Dr. E.F. Morris, who was the House Governor of London Hospital. And he writes, medical advice, influenza. Prevention is better than cure. Don't be frightened. If you get a bad cold or throat, go to bed and stay there for 4 or 5 days. Influenza only becomes dangerous when you do not go to bed. Dissolve a teaspoonful of salt into a tumbler of warm water and gargle your throat and mouth 3 times a day. Do not go into crowds. Wear warm clothes. Don't talk about influenza. It will go sooner if you don't talk about it. Influenza is a disease that likes to be noticed. Keep cheerful and laugh. Infectious diseases let cheerful people alone. And this came from Dr. E.F. Morris, who was the House Governor of London Hospital, and it was published in the Essex County Standard in October 1918, but also in several other newspapers as well.
However, other official advice whilst the war was on was muddled. Health notices were sent out recommending windows and doors in properties be opened to allow the air to circulate. At the same time, bearing in mind it was October and November, other officials in charge of the blackout regulations patrolled the streets and went round and told the occupants to ensure all windows and doors were sealed to kill any lighting. Which now brings me on to commerce. In times of crisis, many take the opportunity to offer cures and remedies. Some of the following are straightforward display advertisements. Other advice is often buried in the text of a news article, and perhaps at times there is a conflict of interest. I'll leave you to judge. Let's have a look at some of these, and please listen carefully to the first.
Now, this was published in the Colchester Gazette in November 1918. It's headed Prevention of Infection. Dr. Thresh, the County Medical Officer for Essex, strongly recommends the spraying of rooms used for meetings of all kinds, which mean anything from a committee room to a cathedral. The spray recommended is a 2% solution of formalin. If formalin is not available, use Sanitas. It is not as strong as disinfectant, but has a pleasant odour, said Dr. Thresh. Dr. Thresh added, there are many sprays on the market, but the one I recommend is probably the cheapest and best. It was devised by Dr. Mackenzie of Scotch LGB. It can be obtained with full instructions from the Thresh Disinfector Company, Westminster. And this is the cheapest concoction reported since the war began. And now we have the Spanish flu and gas, which again was buried in a news article. And it talks of wonderful cures by old remedy, Vino's lightning cough cure. Lance Corporal A.J. Turner of the 4th Essex Regiment writes, I was in hospital and lying opposite me was a sergeant in the Royal Field Artillery who was badly gassed. It was awful to hear him coughing night and day. Knowing Vino's, I told him of it, and from the first dose all the fellows in the ward noticed a decrease in his coughing. In 6 weeks that same man proceeded to a convalescent hospital in my company. 2 men and myself affected with the Spanish flu found instantaneous relief in Vinos. That was from the Saffron Walden Weekly News of the 4th of October 1918. This from the Essex Weekly News of the 20th December 1918. On behalf of invalids, it is deeply to be regretted that the influenza epidemic coincided with a shortage of Bovril. On behalf of invalids, Bovril Limited wish to thank all those who refrained from buying Bovril during this period. More bottles and therefore more Bovril will be available early in the new year. Now this is an interesting one from the Essex County Standard of November 1918. The influenza epidemic. The new epidemic known as the Spanish influenza is claiming its victims all over Europe. Fortunately, it is of a mild character, and if persons infected by it take precautions, there will not be much danger. It is a remarkable fact that smokers are less liable to attack than non-smokers, which should remind readers of this paragraph that Rough Cut Virginia is the finest medium-strength tobacco on the market. And we also have PEPs, the infection-killing tablets. That's 1 and 3 from all chemists and drugstores. This one here, in case of illness, perhaps the first in working from home. With a telephone in the house, the businessman can keep in touch with his office and transact all matters requiring immediate attention. The doctor, the chemist, or friends are within a moment's call. And how about after flu, the best of good spirits? Yours again, Dewar's White Label Whiskey. And from Ovaltine, this is influenza weather. Ovaltine, tonic food beverage, fortifies the body against epidemics. And if whiskey's not your tipple, try Howard's Rich Pasteurised Milk. And to safeguard yourself against the epidemic of winter ailments, drink each day an extra pint. And last but not least, avoid influenza, maintain vitality, OXO, used in millions of homes.
The flu epidemic died out, at least in Essex, during the latter part of 1918. In December 1918 there was a general election, the first for 8 years, and thereafter the flu catastrophe was largely forgotten. So, this is more or less the end of the talk, but I have received some comments and questions. Jane asked, why did the flu originate in China? Well, I think I said there was only a probability that the flu originated in China. This conclusion was arrived at simply by the fact that the first cases were identified on the west coast of the USA. At the time there was quite a lot of trans-Pacific traffic of shipping between the USA and China, and because the first cases were identified in the west coast of America and then it rapidly spread across the continent, that was quite a distinct possibility. Glennis has asked a question, why did the flu die out? Well, the short answer is it died out as an epidemic form towards the end of November 1918, but as we know, the flu has not died out. It's with us all the time and has been so for hundreds of years. It comes back in various degrees of severity during the winter months. It just so happened in 1918, where a lot of attention on the civilian population had been on the flu, once the war was over and a general election was called, all attention turned elsewhere. Cliff asked a question, are there any treatments that work? Well, the short answer is no. There was advice to cover your face, stay away from crowds, go to bed if you feel unwell, and the only other thing was offered were the various commercial remedies such as OXO or Bovril or smoking as I showed in the slides that came before. So where were we? That was Cliff. Now, I've received a comment from Alan Pamphilon. He commented that he had applied to have a heritage plaque for Dr. Thresh, who he described as a blunt Yorkshireman. This plaque is to be put up on Clarence House in the New London Road, and that's up near the Rising Sun in Chelmsford. Yes, and I got an email later from Shirley and Paul, who asked about the Chinese Labour Corps. Well, there is a monument to them in Popperinge in Belgium, which is just the west of Ypres. So they are remembered there in Belgium, and I would say a visit to the cemeteries when we're able in Belgium or France is a very moving experience. So that's really about all. Thank you for the questions, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I will now end with showing a short selection of slides from what you've seen earlier, and that's about it. So thank you very much. Thank you to Paul and Pam. Thank you and goodbye.